My name is Ariana Blake, and on my 36th birthday, I learned exactly how far a family can go when they think you'll never fight back. It happened at a seafood restaurant on the San Diego harbor. One moment, I was blowing out a small candle the waiter brought over, pretending everything was fine. The next, my sister's kid ripped my purse off the back of my chair and sprinted toward the railing like he'd been planning it all night. He turned, looked me dead in the eyes, and shouted, "Dad says you don't deserve nice things," before throwing my purse straight into the water below. Laughter exploded behind him, loud, careless, mean. It wasn't the laugh of a child who didn't know better. It was the laugh of adults who wanted me to hear how funny my humiliation was. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just stood up, grabbed my daughter's hand, and walked out while their laughter echoed behind me. They thought I'd go home and cry. They thought I'd swallow it like I always did. Instead, that night, I opened my banking app, scrolled to the automatic payments I'd been covering for far too long, and shut down the one thing they depended on the most. By 9:05 the next morning, her car was already gone. And that was only the beginning. Before I continue, make sure you hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment if you've ever dealt with toxic family behavior. Your support helps these stories reach more people. By the time I got home that night, a familiar heaviness settled into my chest, one I'd carried for years without naming. It wasn't sadness or anger. It was the quiet recognition of a pattern I had allowed for far too long. Something that had threaded itself through every part of my adult life without ever being challenged. Driving back with Riley in the passenger seat made it impossible to ignore the tension building inside me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The silence between us carried everything I hadn't said out loud. Growing up, I had always been the steady one in my family, the person everyone leaned on when things slipped out of place. It wasn't something I chose. It was simply the role that stuck to me before I realized it had become permanent. My daughter, Riley, learned early that stability was precious, and I tried my best to give her the version of life I wished I'd had. Steady, predictable, free of the emotional chaos that tended to swirl around the people I shared blood with. Simone had always been different. She moved through life as though someone else should absorb the fallout of her choices. At first, it seemed harmless. Little favors, small debts, forgotten responsibilities. But over the years, those small things turned into larger ones, and I slipped into the role of problem solver before I knew how deeply I had sunk. When she married Logan, the pattern only intensified. He carried an effortless confidence that disguised irresponsibility as charm. Whenever their finances dipped, the solution somehow drifted toward me. I never advertised the help I gave. Riley knew some of it, but not all. I didn't want her growing up thinking generosity meant letting people drain you until you had nothing left for yourself. Still, I had filled the gaps in Simone's life for a long time. The overdue car payments, the rising rent, the costly after-school program that their son attended because Simone insisted he needed structure. Each time, I convinced myself it was temporary, that one day Simone and Logan would regain their footing. But every month I covered, the excuses became easier for them and harder for me to justify. As I walked through the doorway that night, I felt the weight of those years settle more heavily than usual. Riley went to her room without turning on the lights, and I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the dark window. I had built a life that functioned, even when my family did not. Yet I still carried the burden of their choices as if they were my responsibility. The memory of earlier that evening pressed against my thoughts. Not the loud moment that any stranger could have noticed, but the quieter ones. The way Simone avoided eye contact when things grew tense. How Logan smirked whenever someone hesitated to call out his son's behavior. How my parents watched everything with a familiar combination of discomfort and resignation. It dawned on me how long I had tolerated that dynamic, convincing myself it was easier to absorb the discomfort than to challenge it. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. just a calm acknowledgement that I no longer wanted to be part of a cycle where respect was optional, but my support was expected. I thought about Riley again, how she sat still at that table earlier, how tightly she held onto her napkin, how her shoulders tensed whenever someone raised their voice. She had grown up seeing me put everyone else first. I didn't want that to be the version of adulthood she learned from. The truth was simple. I had accepted a level of imbalance for years, and it had only taught the people around me that I would always bend. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself to see the smaller details I had brushed aside. The missed calls asking for just one more month. The way Logan acted like financial help was owed, not offered. The messages from Simone framed as emergencies that somehow repeated themselves every few weeks. The relief I felt every time they temporarily pulled themselves together, only for the pattern to restart. Standing in my living room, I realized I had never questioned why I kept filling those gaps. Maybe I had wanted to prove that I could hold everything together, even when no one else tried. Maybe I thought that stability meant being indispensable. Or maybe I had been afraid that withdrawing support would unravel the little semblance of peace that still existed between us. But now, the idea of continuing felt impossible. Not because of one moment, but because the years leading up to it had accumulated into a quiet exhaustion I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my family through excuses. I was looking at them through the eyes of someone who had finally recognized the cost of staying silent. I knew the days ahead would be difficult. People like Simone and Logan didn't accept boundaries without a fight. They had grown comfortable leaning on me, and taking that away would shift the ground beneath them. Still, I felt something new rising, a sense that reclaiming my own life didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. And honesty, I realized, was something my family had never truly learned to handle. The next morning arrived with a strange clarity, the kind that comes after a long night of replaying decisions you can't take back. I woke before my alarm, sat on the edge of my bed, and felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle in. It wasn't confidence, it was simply the absence of hesitation, a feeling I hadn't expected but didn't question. I knew exactly what needed to happen, and for once, there was no bargaining with myself about whether it was too extreme. Autopay had become such a routine part of my life that turning it off felt like removing invisible threads I hadn't realized were wrapped around me. Those monthly withdrawals had blended into the background long ago, swallowed by the belief that helping family meant never keeping score. I had convinced myself it was temporary, that someday Simone and Logan would recover enough to take over the responsibilities I had assumed for them. But that day never came, and pretending it might had only delayed the inevitable. With the payments disabled, I expected silence. I expected at least a few days before they noticed. But before the morning fully settled in, my phone vibrated relentlessly on the nightstand. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. The pattern was predictable: early panic, midday anger, and late-night guilt. It was the rhythm their crises always followed. I let the phone ring. If I answered, I knew I would be pulled back into the role they preferred: mediator, fixer, buffer. Instead, I placed the phone face down and let the vibration fade into the background. Riley walked into the kitchen with her hair still tangled from sleep, and for a moment, I felt grateful she hadn't heard any of the noise coming through my phone. She didn't need to carry the weight of choices that weren't hers. The calls continued through mid-morning. Each one seemed to carry a sharper urgency than the last, but I stayed detached. I had spent years rearranging my life to keep theirs from falling apart. Hearing their panic now only reminded me how deeply they relied on the assumption that I would always intervene. It was almost surreal to witness the collapse begin without lifting a finger. When the first message came through, it wasn't a question. It was a declaration, a digital burst of disbelief that their world had shifted without warning. I didn't open it. The next notification arrived seconds later, then another. I silenced my phone completely and finally exhaled. Not long after, I saw a voicemail appear from an unfamiliar number. I ignored it until curiosity pushed me to listen. It wasn't Simone or Logan. It was the property manager, Shelby, her tone measured and professional. She explained there had been an issue with the usual transfer and asked whether I wanted to adjust the payment date. She sounded unaware of the storm gathering around her. I called her back, choosing my words carefully. I told her there would be no more transfers from my account and that all future arrangements should be handled directly with the tenants. It was the first time I had spoken aloud the boundary I had drawn the night before. Shelby paused, processing the shift, then simply acknowledged it and ended the call. It was strangely grounding to say it out loud, to hear myself claim responsibility only for what truly belonged to me. The afternoon brought a different kind of energy. Panic had transformed into frustration. The notifications that lit up my phone carried a distinct urgency I didn't need to read to understand. I had heard that tone for years, in phone calls, rushed conversations, whispered complaints. It was the sound of people scrambling to rebuild a safety net they assumed would always be there. Except this time, the net had been removed without warning. I spent the day working, maintaining a calm that felt almost foreign. There was no satisfaction in watching the chaos unfold. What I felt instead was distance, like stepping back from a painting I had been standing too close to. For so long, I had been trapped in the details, trying to fix flaws that weren't mine. Now I could finally see the full picture, and it no longer felt like my responsibility. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room when the next message arrived. I didn't need to open it to sense its intent. The subject line preview was enough. A tone that had shifted from confusion to blame. That familiar attempt to reframe responsibility, to make me reconsider, to remind me of the role they believed I was obligated to play. I put the phone aside again, feeling a quiet resolve settle deeper into place. Their panic didn't belong to me anymore. Their bills weren't mine to manage. Their expectations were no longer commitments I was required to keep. For the first time in years, I stayed firmly within my own life instead of spilling into theirs. And as I made dinner for Riley that night, I realized something important. Silence could be an answer too, one that didn't need explaining, defending, or apologizing for. It was the kind of silence that marked the beginning of a different way of living, one that didn't revolve around cleaning up the consequences other people created for themselves. By the following afternoon, a subtle tension settled into the day, a kind that didn't announce itself loudly but lingered beneath every task I attempted to finish. Work felt strangely distant, like I was moving through my responsibilities without fully stepping into them. Even simple things, like making coffee or answering routine emails, carried an undercurrent of awareness I couldn't shake. I knew something was brewing on the other side of the silence I had chosen, and it was only a matter of time before it reached me. It didn't take long. The first real shift came when my inbox lit up with a notification from the learning center that enrolled Simone's son. The message was brief, structured, and impersonal, a reminder that an overdue balance had placed his account on hold. I stared at the email longer than necessary, absorbing the layers beneath its straightforward tone. It wasn't my responsibility anymore, yet my mind instinctively traced the ripple effects this would cause. I had spent so long cushioning the consequences of their decisions that witnessing those consequences unfold felt strangely unfamiliar. A wave of guilt flickered briefly, softer than before but still recognizable. Old patterns didn't break overnight. But instead of letting the guilt guide me, I set my phone down and allowed the feeling to pass without acting on it. The hold notice didn't belong to me. It belonged to the people who had insisted they didn't need boundaries, right up until those boundaries finally existed. Not long after, a new stream of notifications buzzed through my phone. I didn't open them, yet I could read the shift in tone from the preview lines alone. What had started as confusion had evolved into accusation. The phrasing changed from uncertainty to entitlement, as if the absence of support required an explanation, as if withholding money was the true offense. It was the kind of tone that assumed dependence was a duty rather than a choice. I placed the phone face down again, but the tension didn't fade this time. My parents' names appeared on the screen next, and that was when the familiar heaviness returned. Their involvement always brought complexities I couldn't easily navigate. They saw themselves as mediators, but their version of peace had always been built on avoidance, quiet agreements, unspoken sacrifices, and a persistent hope that problems would dissolve if no one addressed them directly. When my mother's voicemail came through, her voice carried a mixture of worry and a faint strain of disappointment. She didn't ask for details. She rarely did. Instead, she commented on the timing, the impact, the possibility that this decision might create unnecessary tension. She spoke as though the disruption itself was the problem, not the years of imbalance that led to it. My father's message followed soon after, quieter, more neutral, offering the same tired reassurance that things could be worked out. He said it gently, unaware that the words no longer settled the way they used to. Their responses didn't anger me. They simply highlighted a truth I had ignored for too long. My family had always been more comfortable with imbalance than confrontation. They preferred tension distributed quietly rather than addressed openly. And for years, I had participated in that arrangement without question. But standing in the middle of this new silence, I could finally recognize how exhausting it had been. As the hours passed, I noticed Riley studying me with a careful kind of concern. She didn't ask what was happening. She rarely did when the subject involved extended family, but she watched the way I moved around the kitchen, the way I set down my phone with deliberate calm. Her intuitive awareness made me more resolved, not less. She had seen enough. She didn't need to witness another cycle of me bending to keep the peace. I spent the rest of the day keeping myself occupied with things that had nothing to do with the unraveling happening elsewhere. I focused on work, prepared dinner, and tried to carve out a small pocket of normalcy. Yet underneath it all, I felt a growing clarity. The messages from Simone, the shift in tone from Logan, the gentle pressure from my parents, each piece fit into a larger pattern I could finally see without distortion. I wasn't responsible for repairing the fallout. I wasn't responsible for smoothing over the disruption that came from finally stepping out of a role I had never truly chosen. The truth, though uncomfortable, was becoming sharper by the hour. Once the support disappeared, the structure they depended on began collapsing exactly where it had always been weakest. And for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to hold it up. The next morning had a heaviness to it, the kind that settles into a house long before anything loud happens. I felt it the moment I stepped into the hallway, as if the air itself had shifted, waiting for something to reach our doorstep. There was no alarm to trigger the feeling, just an instinct that had grown sharper over the past few days. I carried it with me as I moved through the routine of getting ready, knowing it wasn't just my imagination. It didn't take long for that instinct to prove itself. When I walked out to the driveway, the faint morning light caught something on the side of my car, an unfamiliar mark etched into the paint. At first, I thought it was a reflection or a streak from the sprinklers, but as I stepped closer, the truth shaped itself clearly. A deliberate, jagged line stretched from the front panel toward the back wheel, sharp enough to catch against my fingertips when I traced it. There was no shock, only a quiet stillness. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was a choice, carved clean and cruel across the surface, a message disguised as damage. The realization settled in slowly, like a weight pressing down rather than crashing. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the morning quiet wrap around the moment. The neighborhood was calm, the street empty. Nothing out of place except the clear intention scratched into my car. I knew exactly why it was there, even if no one had said a word. The sense of intrusion seeped deeper the longer I looked at it. It wasn't just about the repair cost or the inconvenience. It was the feeling of someone stepping into my space, slipping past an invisible line I had assumed they wouldn't dare cross. That assumption had been naive. I could see that now with unsettling clarity. Inside the house, Riley was getting ready for school, unaware of what I had found outside. I didn't want her to absorb any more than she already had, so I forced my mind into a steady rhythm as I prepared her breakfast. The contrast between the quiet kitchen and the violation outside felt almost surreal. Somehow, both moments belonged to the same life. As I moved through the morning, my thoughts kept circling back to the scratch. The gesture itself wasn't surprising, but its meaning echoed with a sharpness I couldn't ignore. It suggested frustration reaching a point where boundaries no longer mattered, where consequences felt justified simply because someone felt wronged. Their anger had shifted into something more reckless, something that demanded escalation. The rest of the day unfolded under that awareness. I tried to focus on work, but the image of the damaged car lingered at the edge of every task, refusing to fade into the background. It wasn't fear that followed me. It was a clarity about how fragile this new distance truly was. Stepping away from people who relied on me had set off reactions I couldn't control, and now those reactions were becoming unpredictable. At midday, I found myself replaying the possibilities. The timeline fit too neatly to be coincidence. The sudden shift from frantic messages to silence, the simmering resentment that had built over the last 48 hours, the sense of entitlement that always flared when they felt deprived. The damage on my car wasn't just an outburst. It was an attempt to provoke, to draw me back into a conflict I had walked away from. But I didn't respond. I didn't send a message or make a call. I didn't give the moment the reaction it sought. Instead, I photographed the scratch, saved it quietly, and returned to my work. Not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. Some actions didn't need immediate confrontation. They needed documentation, distance, and a clear mind. By the time late afternoon arrived, the unease had settled into something almost steady. I wasn't waiting for the next disruption, yet part of me recognized that another was likely on the way. Still, this shift felt different from the earlier chaos. It wasn't panic or guilt, it was awareness, an understanding of the direction things were moving and the line that had already been crossed. That evening, while Riley worked on homework at the dining table, I sat nearby with my laptop open but untouched. My thoughts drifted between the present moment and the space outside our home, where the car sat quietly despite the scar carved into its side. The house felt safe, but the world beyond it no longer did. And acknowledging that truth brought its own kind of calm. I wasn't surprised by the escalation. The only surprise was how quickly it had come. But even in the middle of that realization, something in me had settled. The line they had crossed wasn't mine to fix. It wasn't mine to soften. It wasn't mine to reinterpret. It simply existed now, clear and undeniable. That clarity didn't bring comfort, but it brought certainty. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. And certainty, even when heavy, had a steadiness I could hold on to. Later that week, a new kind of tension settled into the atmosphere. Less immediate than the vandalism, but sharper in its own way. It crept in through ordinary moments, blending into the edges of the day while I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I noticed it while driving home from work, while unloading groceries, even while folding Riley's laundry. It was the quiet awareness that things had shifted again, though nothing visible had changed yet. The first hint arrived through an unexpected email from the community office at Riley's school. The subject line was simple, but something about it pulled my attention immediately. It wasn't alarming, at least not at first glance. It was a routine notice about a phone inquiry regarding student schedules. Yet as I scanned the message, a heaviness spread through my chest. The staff member mentioned an unfamiliar caller attempting to access daily information, someone who claimed to be me but failed verification. My hands tightened around the phone as I read it twice, then a third time. The idea of someone calling her school, using my name, pretending to be me, skimmed the border between arrogance and intrusion. It felt different from the earlier acts, different from the financial panic or the property damage. This was an interest in Riley, not me. The shift struck something far deeper than irritation or frustration. For a moment, the room around me faded, leaving only the weight of that realization. The boundary they were now approaching wasn't mine to negotiate or soften. It belonged to my daughter, and crossing it carried a significance I couldn't ignore. Protecting her had always been the one part of my life I didn't compromise. As the evening settled in, I found myself replaying the situation from every angle. The attempts to reach me had been persistent, then aggressive, then silent. The pattern was unmistakable. Each escalation came from the same source, only shaped differently each time. And now the silence had expanded outward towards someone who had nothing to do with the conflict, except for sharing my last name. While I prepared dinner, I moved slowly, letting my thoughts shift into a clearer form. I knew the call wasn't random. I knew it wasn't a mistake. Someone had gone looking for information they had no right to access. Information that could shape Riley's day, her movements, her routines. The violation sat heavily with me, pushing aside any remaining hesitation from earlier days. The night grew quiet as Riley worked at the kitchen table, her pencil tapping a steady rhythm against her notebook. She didn't sense anything unusual, and I didn't want to disturb her calm. But I couldn't sit still. I walked down the hallway, breathing slowly, letting the implications settle fully before I took the next step. The decision formed itself without debate. I wasn't reacting out of fear or anger. I was responding to a line that had been crossed cleanly and deliberately. I gathered the documentation, the email, the time of the inquiry, the verification notes, and organized them with a clarity that surprised me. It felt less like a confrontation and more like a responsibility finally taking shape. When I finished, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the papers spread out beside me. Each item represented a moment where the situation had shifted beyond inconvenience or disrespect. It had reached into safety, into privacy, into the core of what I was willing to tolerate. There was no guilt in acknowledging that, only certainty. As the night deepened, I found myself sitting in the quiet, letting the weight of the day settle without pushing it away. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't even surprised anymore. I felt something else entirely, an odd, grounded determination that didn't waver when I examined it. It was the realization that some boundaries weren't meant to be negotiated but enforced. Even the house seemed to react differently, as if absorbing the shift in my resolve. The thoughts that had once spiraled now arranged themselves clearly. I wasn't questioning whether I should take action. I was deciding how far it needed to go to restore the safety that had been threatened. Nothing dramatic happened that night. There were no new messages, no unexpected knocks at the door. Everything remained still. But beneath that stillness, the direction of things had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. And though the quiet felt heavy, it also felt final, like the moment before a door closes with purpose rather than anger. The shift came quietly at first, noticeable only in the steady rhythm of the evening settling around the house. I felt it while washing the dishes after dinner, the warm water running over my hands as my mind kept circling around the decisions waiting for me. The stillness carried a strange clarity, one that replaced hesitation with something sharper and more grounded. I could sense an endpoint approaching, not with drama, but with the calm that follows long periods of holding on. Later that night, after Riley had gone to bed, I sat alone at the dining table. The lamp above cast a soft glow across the scattered notes and documents I had collected over the past days. Everything was arranged with a precision I didn't usually apply to personal matters, but this time, order felt necessary. It wasn't about retaliation. It wasn't even about closure. It was about acknowledging what had unfolded and choosing a direction that didn't bend around someone else's chaos. I reviewed each item one more time, feeling the weight of every page. The record from the school stood out first, its quiet wording carrying far more meaning than its appearance suggested. The notes about the caller who claimed to be me formed a boundary I couldn't ignore. Next came the photos of the car, the scarred paint catching the flash of my camera in a way that made the intent impossible to dismiss. Layered beneath those were the financial statements that marked the years of support I had provided without question or gratitude. As I looked over everything, an unexpected calm took shape. I realized that none of these actions were isolated moments. They were chapters in a pattern, pieces of a story that had been unfolding long before I had been willing to acknowledge it. And now, with everything laid out in front of me, the story had become impossible to overlook. The following morning arrived cool and quiet, without urgency or noise. I woke before the sun rose and moved through the house slowly, as if preparing myself for a moment that required steadiness. When the time felt right, I gathered the documents and placed them neatly into a folder. There was no rush, no adrenaline, just a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. Driving to the precinct, I kept the windows slightly open, letting the morning air steady my thoughts. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't need to. The truth had already shaped itself into something clear and simple, something that didn't require justification. When I walked into the building, the cool, structured environment felt strangely reassuring. I approached the front desk, provided the documents, and explained what had occurred. The officer took everything with a level of professionalism that reminded me why this step mattered. He reviewed the information carefully, flipping through the photos and statements with steady attention. As he scanned the details, I felt a quiet sense of distance settle in. Not detachment, but acceptance. I had done what needed to be done. There was no turning back, and no part of me wished to. The process unfolded methodically, each step confirming that the situation was now moving into hands more capable of handling what I no longer wished to carry. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like protection. Protection of my space, my home, my daughter, and the life I had worked so hard to build. Walking back to my car afterward, I noticed how different the air felt. Lighter somehow, as if a held breath had finally been released. Over the next several days, the consequences began to emerge with a quiet inevitability. I didn't seek updates, but information found its way to me through channels I couldn't entirely avoid. The damaged car was traced through evidence I had provided. The impersonation attempt at the school was classified with the seriousness it deserved, and the financial records supporting the timeline of manipulation helped shape the broader understanding of the situation. I didn't celebrate any of it. There was nothing to celebrate. But there was a sense of justice woven through the unfolding events, a reminder that choices, when made repeatedly, eventually create their own gravity. As everything progressed, I focused on maintaining the stability inside my home. I invested my energy into work, into preparing meals with Riley, into small conversations that grounded both of us in routines far away from the chaos outside. In those quiet moments, I realized how deeply peace could reshape a life once you stopped allowing others to pull you away from it. There was no apology waiting for me, no message seeking understanding, no attempt to repair what had been damaged long before the conflict began. Silence replaced the earlier noise, but the silence didn't ache the way it once did. It felt appropriate, a natural outcome of the distance that had finally been enforced. Weeks later, when the final pieces of the process concluded, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, just closure. A door that had once stayed half open out of habit had finally closed with finality, and I didn't feel the urge to open it again. In the stillness that followed, I understood something I had overlooked for years. Protecting your own peace is not cruelty, it's survival. The lesson settled deeply, reshaping parts of me I hadn't realized were worn thin. I learned that boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out. They're foundations built to keep your life steady. And when someone chooses to cross them, the consequences are theirs to carry. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding anything together for anyone else. And the quiet that remained wasn't emptiness. It was freedom.